Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to continue our discussion of the civil rights movement by moving into the more radical phase of the movement when we start to see splinter groups break away from the sort of what we think of as the unified sort of nonviolent civil disobedience part of the civil rights movement and start expressing different opinions about the goals or the methods that the civil rights movement should try to use. So here's our objectives for today. I'll apologize in advance for the sort of nasal congestion, and hopefully that won't interrupt the video too much. So here we go. As the civil rights movement moved into the 1960s, we started to see breakaway groups and people like Malcolm X who started to present different visions for both what the civil rights movement should be, what the goals should be, and what the methods should be. So here's Malcolm X's famous ballots or bullets speech, or part of it at least. So take a moment, pause, and read it, and we'll keep moving on. Here's his message to the grassroots. So we could see clearly Malcolm X had a very different vision of how the March on Washington happened, what its goals sort of were/weren't, and how the establishment part of the civil rights movement and the political establishment co-opted what could have been a grassroots sort of impromptu movement into something far more sanitary and acceptable to the authorities. And so Malcolm X was in the early days of the civil rights movement, at least until his assassination, was sort of one of the leading voices of more radicalism within the Black civil rights movement. At the same time, you had the Vietnam War heating up during this time period. The Vietnam War had, of course, been going on since, Dien Bien Phu in '54, with the U.S. providing advisors for this South Vietnamese regime. No Dinh Diem was assassinated was incredibly unpopular in South Vietnam, as a Catholic ruling over a predominantly Buddhist country. We had the famous self-immolation of Buddhist monks protesting his brutality, which obviously made the U.S. look incredibly bad. And Diem himself was assassinated by some of his army officers. And South Vietnam is really going to collapse into chaos in 63. And so the Kennedy administration is going to have to deal with these two problems. One, the push for a civil rights bill, and of course, the beginnings of fractures within the civil rights movement, and also the increasingly escalating situation in Vietnam. Because it was clear in 63 that really without some U.S. intervention, much more intensive U.S. intervention, South Vietnam was going to collapse as a state, and North Vietnam was going to be able to reunify the country under Ho Chi Minh's rule. And so these are the two crises that Kennedy was faced when he headed to Dallas and was assassinated. Lee Harvey Oswald was able to assassinate John F. Kennedy from the upper floor of a book repository in Dallas, Texas. He was riding in an open limousine when he was shot in the head and killed. And then, fueling future conspiracy theories, Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner with potential mob ties, then killed Lee Harvey Oswald. And then Jack Ruby killed himself before we could figure out much details about what happened in all of this. And so obviously the JFK assassinations conspiracies are an incredibly deep well that I don't have the time to delve into. So if you're interested, there's lots out there. Feel free to explore it. The important relevant pieces for us is that with JFK gone, Lyndon Johnson is going to ascend to the presidency. And Lyndon Johnson is a very different guy than Kennedy. He's this massive Texan. He was the former Speaker of the House. He's an incredibly effective legislator. And I always loved James Eastland's line here, quote, "Good God, Lyndon's president. He's going to pass a lot of this damn fool stuff." And so with Johnson in office, he's easily going to be able to usher things through Congress. Johnson was a former House whip responsible for, rallying votes, and a former House Speaker. And so he is easily going to be able to, well, as the cartoon shows, metaphorically play the 88th Congress like a piano, using often what's called the Johnson treatment to get votes. It's a combination of flattery, bribery, threats, invasions of personal space, things like that. And he uses this to go to work, quote unquote, on people he wants to get votes from and basically convince them to vote the way he wants. And so he is going to be one of our most effective presidents as far as getting legislation through, certainly almost as effective as his mentor and sort of the guy that he wanted to emulate, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And so the Democrats are going to be able to pass sweeping programs, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which it's tough to say. I mean, it's tough to say if the Kennedy administration would have been able to pass the Civil Rights Act of 64. But with Johnson in office, the Civil Rights Act is absolutely going to happen. It's going to ban discrimination. It's going to basically expand on the 14th Amendment and provide significant enforcement pieces of the 14th Amendment. It's going to make much more specific that Jim Crow has to go. And it's going to ban discrimination and provide federal enforcement tools for a whole bunch of different things. And so this is absolutely huge. We have groundbreaking civil rights legislation that can now be effectively used to attack Jim Crow, which is, again, completely groundbreaking and transformative. As a result of this, civil rights activists are going to change their focus. In the Freedom Summer, we're going to see young people, especially, heading down to the South to try to register Black people to vote, to try to strike down all of the sort of racist Jim Crow era voting restrictions that have put in place in order to re-enfranchise Black people. And so the Freedom Summer was massive voter registration drives across the South. And the Johnson administration was brought involved when 3 civil rights workers, I'll let you read the Southern opinion on this, because obviously the South is not going to be thrilled about this. So pause, read, let's move on. Specifically, the murder of these 3 Northern college students and the failure to bring anyone effectively to justice for this is going to lead to increasing pressure on the Johnson administration to do something to secure voting rights for Black people. And so as a result of this, here's the effect of this and what they sort of illustrated. So pause, read, let's move forward. And the Johnson administration is going to be pressure is going to be put on them to pass some sort of voting rights legislation. So for the election of 1864, LBJ is going to be running for re-election in his own right, not just filling out Kennedy's term. The Republicans are going to go with a relatively unknown, they're going to go with the conservative wing of the party and nominate a guy named Barry Goldwater of Arizona. And so this is going to be one of the more contentious presidential elections for a whole host of different reasons. Goldwater might have made some inflammatory comments about the use of atomic weapons and, about Kennedy's space program and stuff like that. Also threatened to bomb Russia. Threatened to use nuclear devices in the Vietnam War, or use nuclear bombs in the Vietnam War. And this is incredibly important because there was an incident in 1964 which we'll talk about in a minute, in which there was a confrontation between a U.S. destroyer and some North Vietnamese ships. The Goldwater campaign tried to double down on his rhetoric, saying, quote, "In your heart, you know he's right." Whereas the Johnson campaign ran the famous Daisy ad, which I'm not going to show in its entirety here, but you should definitely go watch it. It's pretty breathtaking. And countered with, "In your guts, you know he's nuts." Johnson's also going to try to paint himself as the natural heir to FDR with his sweeping program known as the Great Society, which we're going to spend a lot of time talking about next time. 64 was a sweeping win for Johnson, both because of sympathy from the assassination of Kennedy, Johnson's anti-poverty programs, and Goldwater's perceived extremism. This is also the first election where we see the deep southern states flipping from Democratic to Republican. This is really the end of the Dixiecrats as we know them. Not completely. There's still going to be some conservative Democrats out there. But as far as electorally, the South is now going to be firmly in the Republican camp because of Johnson's support for the whole civil rights platform. And in the aftermath of this, and specifically the Selma March, where MLK set up a march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, in order to raise support for voting rights. When his marchers did not get anywhere close, being attacked on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, as Ed was unable to complete the march. This led to increasing pressure to Johnson to sign the Voting Rights Act, which is going to outlaw a lot of the sort of electoral and Jim Crow era chicanery that prevented Black people from voting, and is going to, for the most part, re-enfranchise Black people throughout the South and put elections in southern states under federal supervision to ensure that they are done fairly. From here, with civil rights and voting rights complete, the civil rights movement is going to move on to other issues. This is going to create some pretty significant divides within the movement. Busing is going to be attempted to be used to challenge de facto school segregation. Affirmative action is going to be created in order to challenge what are described as a pattern of racist hiring practices. And the Black Power movement is going to rise to attempt to build up Black institutions and parallel Black institutions as an alternative to integration. This is going to become an incredibly sort of difficult and contentious fight that we're still fighting about to this day. But it's important to know where this comes out of. So this comes out of the victories of the civil rights movement, where there's questions about, okay, well, where do we go from here? Of course, the famous Mexico City Olympics picture with John Carlos and Tommy Smith was one of the things that sort of shocked Americans out of their complacency, because for a lot of white Americans, they said, well, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act are passed. Why are Black people still agitating? And Black people are saying, well, there's all of these other things that aren't necessarily covered under those two pieces of legislation that are still, barriers for us in achieving what we want to achieve. One of the leaders of this Black Power movement is Stokely Carmichael, who is a young college student who became one of the was originally a leader of SDS and is eventually going to take over the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so pause and take a moment and read his Black Power speech here. And from here, especially after the assassination of Malcolm X, the Black Power movement becomes sort of the unifying force between some of the more radical parts of the civil rights movement. Malcolm X was assassinated by another member of the Nation of Islam, which was a group that he was originally part of, but he kind of distanced himself from. It's complicated. So if you're interested in the assassination of Malcolm X, you should definitely dive into all of that. But his death is really going to sort of galvanize the Black Power movement. And we get groups like the Black Panther Party, which are also radical. I'm not going to go into the whole detail of the Black Panther Party, but they're a Black self-defense organization in its simplest sense, helping to provide community services to Black neighborhoods and to protect Black people both from racism and police brutality. Their embrace of open carry made them appear even more radical, as did their ties to some socialist movements and some calls for reparations and reinvestment in Black communities. And so here's the manifesto of the Black Panther Party. I'll let you pause and read, and then we'll move forward. In the end, the summers of 65 to 68 were incredibly divisive summers for a whole host of different reasons. As progress was not made and the lives of Black people did not appreciably improve in the aftermath of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, what we started to see is unrest. One of the biggest examples was the Watts riot of 65, in which the violent arrest of two young Black men by the LA police led to days of rioting and 34 deaths. But we would see race riots in the summers of 65, 66, 67, and 68 in all of these places. These outpourings of violence really did a lot to sort of affect public opinion. And it led to a shift in support away from civil rights movements from a lot of the sort of white middle-class liberals who had previously been in support of these movements. And so if you don't know about the Watts riots, you should definitely take some time, look into the Watts riots or the Detroit riot or some of the other really big riots of this era. So I'm not going to play this in its entirety, and we're just going to move on. But keep in mind, so here's the Johnson administration trying to respond to these race riots. So pause, read, we'll come back together. Johnson obviously is struggling between restoring order versus being sympathetic to the needs and the issues that Black people in urban areas are suffering. And this is the problem that a lot of politicians deal with, is the riots do a lot to affect public opinion and to sway people's perception of these movements. But at the same time, a lot of these politicians are at least to some degree aligned with the concerns of the people who are rioting, in that they would also like to see greater opportunity and greater investment in neighborhoods, things like that. And so it creates a real complicated problem for politicians in how do we deal with this stuff. The whole thing really falls apart after the assassination of Dr. King. Dr. King was heading to Memphis to help a sanitation workers strike as part of his expanding Poor People's campaign, when he was on a balcony of his motel, the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, when he was assassinated by James Earl Ray here. The death of the Dr. King really destroyed hope for a lot of people and led to massive demonstrations, which often turned violent in all of these cities in the days after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. For a lot of, especially young urban Black people, this represented the end to hope for progress and a peaceful resolution. And for a lot of white people, this rioting really alienated them from the civil rights movement and led to a lack of support for any sort of further gains. The riots of 68 were on a scale that we had not seen before, both in destructive power, in scope, and in violence. And it really felt like the country was coming apart at the seams, right at the time when the Vietnam War was going really poorly for us. And we'll talk more about the Vietnam War next time, because it's important to note that as all of this stuff is happening, as all of this rioting is happening, the Vietnam War is sort of the constant backdrop to all of this. And so one of the demands of the rioters is the disproportionate drafting of Black people to go fight in the Vietnam War. And so all of this is tied up together, creating a sense of hopelessness for a lot of Americans. In the aftermath of the riots, the Kerner Report was created to investigate why Black people were upset. Here's the takeaway from the report. It shouldn't be shocking to anyone that it's racism, basically racism and persistent discrimination. The fact that the disparities between Black and white people are pretty vast at this point. And white flight is leading to continual disinvestment from Black communities. And they proposed three things, three potential paths forward here. So take a moment, read these, and based on your knowledge of American history from this point to the present, keep these in mind, because there's debate as to which one of these three paths we've followed. So the Kerner Report provides sort of a guide for how we could move forward as far as civil rights goes. So those are our three choices. So that'll wrap up the civil rights movement here, at least the African-American civil rights movement. For next time, we'll dive into LBJ's Great Society, the expansion of the Vietnam War, and some of those other pieces. And then after that, we'll expand the civil rights movement out into the women's movement and the American Indian movement and a variety of different civil rights movements stemming from the Black civil rights movement. So that's where we'll leave our narrative from here. Thank you for listening.